But still delving a little deeper into the biblical stories you'll be bringing to us on your upcoming book, much anticipated, reflecting on Genesis chapters 2 and 3 back to the story of Adam and Eve. I believe it's a story which its fundamental theme is about rebellion against divine order, if you will. And so what parallels do you see between the story of Adam and Eve and current societal shifts, especially in how young people today challenge established norms?
So, back in the mid to late 1800s, the German philosopher Nietzsche famously announced that God was dead.
Yep.
And he said, furthermore, that we had killed him. That was the greatest murder that had ever occurred, and that we'd be fortunate indeed if we could find enough water to wash away the blood. And then he predicted that epidemic of nihilism and false utopianism would flood the world in consequence. And that's all true. He got that dead right. What Nietzsche didn't know was that that sort of thing had happened many times before in the past, that this wasn't a unique occurrence. It wasn't the Enlightenment rebellion against God that was only characteristic of Western society. The death of God is a recurrent motif. It was very well documented by the Romanian historian of religion, Mircea Eliade, and it follows a pattern. In any case, Nietzsche's proposed medication for that death was that human beings would have to rise up to the point where they could create their own values. Now, there's two things that are wrong about that. The first is, as you pointed out, that's exactly the sin of Adam and Eve in the garden, is that they are tempted by the spirit of Lucifer in the form of the serpent to presume that they can generate the moral order to themselves, that they can incorporate the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, and that they can now structure the world entirely in accordance with their will. That produces the fall. You can think about it this way in your own life. You could think prideful overreach produces unnecessary suffering. Or you could even say it more simply, beware of biting off more than you can chew. And that is exactly what Adam and Eve do. And that metaphor of inappropriate consumption is part of the underlying symbolic structure of the story. God's insistence to Adam and Eve at the beginning of the story is that human beings are allowed to interact with the garden that's their home, the walled garden, the balance between order and nature that's their home. They can interact with anything in it, and they can do anything they want except to take that final step. And that's what Eve is tempted to do, and that's what Adam follows her in doing. And that's what produces the suffering and even the death that then characterizes the fallen world. So what's the parallel in the modern world? Well, we do believe presumptuously that there is no implicit or divine order, and we do believe presumptuously, especially if we're intellectual, that we can recast man, society, nature, and God in the image that our own intellect is prone to worship. And all that produces is hell. And so, well, then the question arises, well, what's the alternative to that? And, well, the biblical corpus is actually an examination of the appropriate alternative. So, I'll give you an example of that. So,
please do.
The Bible is an analysis of the pattern of sacrifice that's acceptable to God. Right? So that's Abel's pattern of sacrifice, say, contrasted with Cain's. And so, the idea of sacrifice is the idea upon which the community itself is based. This is something Christianity and the Jews before that got dead right. Sacrifice is the basis of community. Okay, why? Well, because if you're going to live with other people, if you're going to have friends, if you're going to have a wife or a husband, if you're going to have business partners, if you're going to live in a town, it can't be all about you. You have to give something up that is in your narrow self-interest in order to establish harmonious relationships with everyone else. So community itself is a sacrificial process. Okay, so, and that's clear. Like, it doesn't take much thought to understand that. when you socialize children, they have to give up their temper tantrums. They have to give up the immediacy of their desires in order to become acceptable as friends and more mature individuals. When you get married, you have to give up other women in relationship to your wife and vice versa. When you become a father, you have to give up that narrow and immediate personal freedom that characterized you as a bachelor, to take a more mature and longer term view of your social surround and the future. And so the community is dependent on sacrifice, and maturity itself is a sacrificial process. Okay, so once you understand that, another question arises, which is, well, if sacrifice is necessary, then what is the optimal sacrifice? And the biblical story develops a representation of the optimal sacrifice. You see it in the story of Abraham. Abraham is called upon to sacrifice everything to God, including his son. Right, which is a very dramatic incident, and the atheist types point to that as the cruelty of God, but they don't. There's something they don't understand. They're missing.
Which is?
You have to offer your children as sacrificial lambs to the world in order for them to both mature and for you to even remain in contact with them. So the psychoanalysts, who were good critics of the Nietzschean presumption, by the way, they pointed out very early, the Freudians, that the good mother had to fail. So what does that mean? Well, if you're the mother of an infant, you protect the infant in every possible way from any sort of damage, and the infant really has no responsibility in that regard. But as the infant matures, say into a toddler and then into a child and an adolescent, the mother has to let go and let the world do its best and its worst to the child. That's a sacrificial gesture. You see this, for example, it's a very famous...
This is quintessential Freudian doctrine.
Absolutely.
Winnicott as well plays into that.
That's right. That's right. They knew this. That's why the Freudians were so leery of the Oedipal mother who overprotects and devours. Well, the alternative is a sacrifice. So there's a famous statue in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Michelangelo. It's the Pieta, and so it's Mary, and Mary is seated, very beautiful and serene, and her son, Christ, is an adult, and in her arms, dead, broken, and she's offering that. That's a good way of thinking about it. Well, what does it mean? It means the good mother offers her child to be broken by the world. And that's right, and that's a sacrificial gesture. So you see, part of the ultimate sacrificial gesture is the offering even of your children upward. Now you remember in the story of Abraham, Abraham is called upon by God to sacrifice Isaac, but because he is willing to do so, he doesn't have to. And so that's a very interesting twist too, because partly what it means is that if you're willing to let your children go and develop and mature, they'll return to you. Instead of running from you and being lost. And so you offer and you get back in consequence. So half of the sacrificial offering is son, and the other half is self. And those come together in the Christian passion, right? Because Christ is the son who's offered, but also the man who completely sacrifices himself to the community. Right, so the Christians got that dead right.
Dr.